What if I told you there was a king who faced the greatest army of his time without raising a sword, without asking for help from foreign powers, without trusting in his own strength, but only in God? In a world where power is measured by armaments, strategic alliances and numbers, existed a man who walked in a dress opposite. While others they trusted in horses, chariots and armies, he trusted into something invisible, in someone eternal. His name was Asa, a king small before the eyes of the men, but gigantic in the presence of God. Today I invite you to travel in He time, but not just to listen to a story ancient, but to understand an eternal principle, because what you are about to discover here can change the way you see faith, spiritual warfare, and the leadership true. We are in the ancient kingdom of Judah, a time of darkness, idolatry, and moral decay. The altars of the true God have been forgotten, replaced by stone images, practices pagans, and a culture that has completely moved away from the darling. And in the midst of that chaos, a child is brought to the throne, not by chance, not by military force, but by a divine call. The story you are going to know today, it is not just a biblical chronicle, it is a reflection of your life and the mine. Because all of us, at some point, we faced armies of a million, medical diagnoses, debts priceless, betrayals, deep anxieties, battles that seem impossible to beat. But Asa leaves us a lesson. It is not about the size of the enemy, but of the size of your trust. And if you believe in God, if you have faith in it, invisible, I want you to write now same in the comments this phrase: my strength comes of the sky, not of the land. Do it now, not by me, but as a public declaration of your faith. If you have his spiritual courage that Asa had, shows that also you are willing to kneel before God instead of surrendering to him. Fear and listen. Okay, don't close this video. Stay until the end, because what I have to tell you isn't just information, it's inspiration. Every second matters. There's a truth here that the modern world has forgotten, and you are about to rediscover it. Let's dive in this story, but first take a deep breath, let your heart open, because what you're about to hear is unordinary. It's not gentle, it's fire, it's heaven, it's living history. This is how it begins, the crossing of King Asa, a man who decided to trust not in the army that he had, but in the God who called. There is no glory in inherit a ruined throne, and that was exactly what Asa received. A kingdom worn down by the idolatry, divided by the corruption, and spiritually disconnected from his purpose. Judah was lost, and his father, the king Abijah, left behind a compromised legacy. Asa was just a child. He had no experience, nor military preparation, nor surrounded by advisors, wise men. But he had something that no one else in that generation, it seemed, have: spiritual sensitivity. Since its first years, Asa watched. He saw as he town worshipped God's strangers, how the true priests were ignored, how the temple was converted in an empty place, more full of dust than divine presence. And could a child shut up, accept what always was like that? No. Asa was called by God, not by lineage but by purpose, not by age but by disposition. In the silence of the palace, among shadows of incense, pagan and corrupted voices, Asa began to cultivate something that would change the history of Judah: a heart willing to obey. It interesting is that Asa did not seek the power. He did not cling to the throne. The throne held him, looked for him, because when heaven seeks an instrument, it matters the age, experience or appearance. He cares about the heart. And here appears the first twist in our history. Asa, without have a visible model of justice, without a solid spiritual heritage, decides to break the cycle. He becomes in the hero reluctant, that archetype that you do not want the crown, but becomes worthy of it by his integrity. It's as if God had planted a seed within Asa that could not be ignored, a gentle but steady fire that said, "This can't go on like this." And that voice, Asa la, I'm listening. Judah, to his around, was a field of moral ruins. The leaders were corrupt, the idols were at every corner, the worship of the true God was just a whisper of the past. But Asa had something the great ones did not have, a hunger for holiness. He understood, even from a young age, that a kingdom could not be rebuilt on shaky foundations. First, the soul of the nation, and that would begin with his own life. The figure of the child king reminds us that the God's call does not wait perfect maturity. He calls when finds disposition, because the faith authenticity is not a question of age, it is a question of dedication. Imagine the weight on the Asa's shoulders, a people waiting for direction, an abandoned temple, an ancestral line stained by sin. How do you deal with all of that without collapsing? The answer is simple, although not easy, with faith. This is the birth of a leadership that does not depend on human strategies, but on a real intimacy with God. Asa not only inherited a throne, inherited a mission, and that mission, it would start as something silent, imperceptible to the eyes of two men, the inner decision to remain faithful. Because sometimes big changes don't start with wars or decrees, but with a heart kneeling secretly. And so began the transformation of Judah. Not with a sword, but with a decision. Not all wars are fought with swords. Some, the most difficult ones, are fought in the soul of a people. Asa understood that better than anyone else, because before they arrived armies foreigners, already there was an enemy much more lethal infiltrated in every house, in every heart, the idolatry. During the first 10 years of his reign, something unusual happened. There was peace, none external threat, no political conflict. For many kings, that would be the time to rest, to accumulate treasures, to enjoy the pleasures of power. But Asa saw in that calm a clear message from God. Now is the time to restore. And what he did next, he was braver than anyone military feat. Asa stood up with determination and was directly to the center of the corruption, the false altars, the sacred poles of Asherah, the temples dedicated to Baal. He not only ordered his destruction, he supervised every action like someone who uproots a disease. The days of idols sharing space with the faith true had finished, but Asa did not stop there. I knew that you cannot renew a nation without touching the foundations of the family authority. That's why he made a decision that shook the entire royal court. He removed his own grandmother, Maacah, of the position of Queen Mother. Maacah, she wasn't just any figure, she was a woman, influential, powerful and protective of the idolatry. Many trembled before the possibility of an internal conflict, but Asa did not hesitate. He destroyed his disgusting image, burned their idols in Kidron Valley, and the dispossession publicly of his title. That what kind of faith is needed to face your own blood for fidelity to God? At that moment, Asa stopped being just a king and became into a spiritual leader. The kind of leader who not only commands but inspires, who not only commands but sets an example. The nation began to change. The priests who were previously in hiding began to teach again. Families who were previously afraid speak. They began to pray out loud. The streets were cleaned not only of physical trash, but of moral filth. The children they heard again, name of the mister in the homes. Judah was finally breathing new air. And it is here that we understand that Asa waged a silent war. There were no screams or arrows fell from the sky, but in it, invisible, something was occurring. Every altar destroyed was a spiritual victory, every image broken, a fortress torn down. Because the true battles are not just against armies, but against systems of thought that enslave. Asa was radical, not because he was cruel, but because he understood something that many leaders have forgotten. You cannot negotiate with the darkness. You can't afford small, harmless idols when you're looking for the glory of God. And the people surprisingly, responded not with rebellion, but with hope, because when an authority lives with integrity, the heart of the people line up more easily, was just as Asa prepared the ground for something bigger. Without knowing it, was forming a generation that would rely more on a creator who, in the war chariots, he was paving the path to miracles. I was winning a war that many, neither not even they saw. Judah, a land that was spiritually dead, was beginning to beat again. A nation is not rebuilt with just demolitions. After the purification comes the building. Asa was not content with destroying the corrupt. He understood that if it is not replaced empty with something holy, evil will return with more force. That is why, after the silent spiritual war, a visible work began, restoration of Judah from its foundations. The first thing he did was to reorganize the priesthood. It was not enough to have men with religious garments. Asa wanted priests with fire in the soul, with knowledge of the law, with a passion true by the God of Israel. He summoned the Levites, revived the system of worship, and put order where there was before disorder. The altar of the Lord, who was broken, was restored with reverence, not as an empty symbol, but as the spiritual heart of a nation that wanted to return to its origin. The religious festivals were celebrated again with meaning. The people brought offerings, not out of obligation, but with gratitude. The spirituality of Judah began to reflect in its streets, in its relationships, in their culture. But Asa too understood something crucial. The faith does not exclude the responsibility. Trust in God, there is no passivity. Therefore, while restored the spiritual dimension, too strengthened the civil and military structure of the kingdom. He ordered the construction of fortified cities, watchtowers, and reinforced walls, not out of paranoia, but out of prudence. He distributed supplies strategically. He organized internal defenses, ensured that his town be protected in case of threat. And yes, it formed an army, no less than 580,000 men trained, divided by tribes, led by officers capable. Not because I trusted they more than in God, but because I knew that the faith manifests itself also in the excellence what we do with what we have to do. Asa is an example living balance. He was not a mystic, disconnected from the reality, nor a pragmatist without space for the divine. It was a king with vision. His trust was in the sky, but his feet were stepping the land with wisdom. This chapter of his reign was a kind of national spring. The economy prospered, culture flourished, fear diminished. Judah's identity was strengthened, not by the imposition of an ideology, but by the restoration of its original purpose, to be a people consecrated to God. And the most surprising thing is that all this occurred without wars. The 10 first years of Asa were a gift from the sky. Time to prepare, to sow, to build with vision, because God knew what was coming. And Asa, although he could not see the future, built as one who waits the storm. Sometimes the years of peace are proof greater than those of conflict. Because we fall asleep, we are distracted, we become complacent. But Asa did not fall in that trap. He understood that the true preparation occurs when there is no pressure. That character is forged in calm. While others kings would have celebrated the stillness with banquets, Asa the converted in a training camp for the faith collective. And that preparation, both spiritual and physical, would be testing very soon. Because the enemy already was in movement, and the roar of war began to be heard distance. Everything seemed in order. Judah was at peace, spiritually restored, protected by walls, guided by a just king. But the enemies of the faith never sleeps. And when you least expect it, darkness hits again. From the land distant of the south, a threat emerged that challenged logic, the strategy and the hope. Zerah, the Ethiopian, was advancing with an army impossible, 1,000,000 soldiers and 300 war chariots. To put it in perspective, Asa had 580,000 men. That it was already impressive, but it wasn't enough. The enemy doubled their forces. with overwhelming brutality and military technology. The Ethiopian tanks were old-fashioned tanks, fast, destructive and unstoppable in open field. When the news arrived in Jerusalem, the panic spread like a plague. Mothers hid their children. The elderly, they spoke of destruction. The leaders trembled, because everyone knew that it was not a battle common, it was a genocide announced. And they all looked at Asa. It was time to decide. Do alliances with Egypt, send messengers to other kingdoms, seek political solutions, bribe the enemy, surrender? But Asa, once again, chose a path that no war manual would recommend, gathered his army, marched toward the Safata Valley, and in the battlefield knelt. Imagine the scene. Thousands of soldiers lined up, the earth shaking from the advance of a huge army. And Asa, the king, not with a sword in the hand, but with the eyes closed, the face to the sky, the knees in the dust. While others kings, they climb towers to observe the strategy enemy. Asa lowers his head to listen to the God who called. It is at this moment that the spiritual leadership reaches its maximum expression, because leading isn't always about moving forward. Sometimes it's about kneeling down first. The tension was palpable. Every second counted. But Asa didn't let the urgency. I knew that without divine direction, any action, it would be useless. This decision puzzled many. How a king stops to pray when enemy is it approaching. But Asa understood something that few they include. True victories are decided before the first blow. They are decided in it, invisible. While Zerah trusted Asa, trusted in his chariots in darling, and so changed everything. This moment is the climax of his leadership. There is no leadership here, miracle yet. There isn't fire of the sky. There is no angels with swords. Only one man, his army, the dust of the valley, and a faith that cuts deeper than any lance. Because the approaching war was not just between two armies. It was between two philosophies, two ways of understanding power, two ways of trusting in the arm of the man or in the hand of God. And Asa, without spectacle, without desperation, he chose believe. The town observed in silence. Some were crying. Others, they gripped their weapons, but everyone knew that something different was happening, that your king was not like the others, and that maybe, just maybe, the sky would move. But the enemy already was too close. In the most critical moment, when the sound of enemy drums made the land, and the soldiers of Judah could hardly breathe for the tension, Asa did something that transformed the battlefield in an altar. He lifted up his voice and prayed. It wasn't a long prayer. There were no complicated speeches or elaborate phrases. It was a direct plea, full of humility and faith. Genuine, "O Lord, you do not need many nor of few to give the victory. Help us, Lord our God, for we trust in you, and in your name we have come against this army. Lord, you are our God. Do not let the man prevail against you." It wasn't a strategy. It was a total surrender. Asa didn't ask for strength. He did not ask for luck. He didn't ask for courage. He asked aid. He recognized his limitation, its vulnerability, its absolute dependence of the darling. In that moment, something invisible broke. Because when a leader surrenders to God publicly, disarming the spiritual enemy, Asa was not only talking with God, was showing the people how a real war is fought. And something even more powerful happened. The Judah's army heard every word. There is no elderly inspiration than a leader who prays with sincerity. Asa did not motivate his town with promises of glory, neither with threats. The reason with faith, with a prayer. That which seemed weakness was transformed in strength. An act that for the world would be madness, was exactly what mobilized darling. In many biblical stories, the prayers are private, but this one was public, open, without fear, because Asa knew that the hidden faith does not ignite nations. While enemy trusted in their number, in their cars, and in his brute force, Asa planted his banner in it, invisible. He declared heaven as his ally, and that it changed everything. That moment was not just a pause before the war, it was the true battle. In the spiritual world, the lines were drawn. Judah's fate was sealed, not when the swords crossed, but when a king decided to pray. And in that moment, the heaven prepared to intervene, because the Asa's prayer was not a cry of despair, was an act of spiritual authority. It was a proclamation of total confidence. It was the faith taking form, not in nice words, but in a posture, on your knees. And so, while the enemy was moving forward with fury, the sky was getting ready to act with power. Asa's prayer was not in vain. It barely ended his plea. The atmosphere changed. Something invisible moved. There was no signs dramatic celestial, nor voices of the sky, nor angels descending with trumpets. But it felt as if a divine force enveloped the army of Judah. And then God acted. The scriptures do not tell us give tactical details. They do not describe military strategies or master moves by commanders. They just say that the Mister defeated Zerah's army before Asa and Judah. Just like that. Can imagine it. 1,000,000 soldiers, war chariots, a threat, unstoppable, falling in confusion, crumbling without Asa having to lift his sword. It was a supernatural, incontestable victory, impossible to attribute to human effort. The Ethiopian army was undone. And most shockingly, Judah barely had to chase them. They didn't fight back like they expected. They didn't bleed like they feared. They just ran after an enemy that already was defeated. By him, darling. The fields, which should have been stained with pain, were filled with loot, with unexpected riches, with signs of a victory that was not earned, but granted. This wasn't just a physical battle. It was a divine intervention designed to make one essential point. When God fights for you, you don't need to understand that how, just trust in him, the town was never the same again same. That one day seal in collective memory an eternal truth. Faith is more powerful than strength, and Asa was exalted not because his military capacity, but by its surrendered heart. While the kings of other nations were adorned with titles of conquerors, Asa received another type of recognition, that of a man of God, that of a leader who knelt before advancing, that of a king who did not need swords to defeat giants. That day, Judah learned something he would never forget. Prayer can what 1,000 armies cannot do. And you, who listen to this story today, are you fighting with your own weapons, or are you letting God fight for you? Because there is battles that are not won with strength. There are enemies who only fall when we surrender, but not to fear, but to the faith. And Asa did it. I knew. That's why expired. After that supernatural victory, Judah did not see war again for 35 years. It was not a negotiated peace. It was not the result of treaties or alliances. It was a peace sown by the faith, watered with obedience, and protected by the fidelity to God. Asa did not convert in a tyrant made great by triumph. He did not seek personal glory, nor did he surround himself with flatterers. He remained upright, humble, and devout. He was one of the few kings of Judah who did not allow themselves to be corrupted by power. The people, inspired by their example, lived a golden age. The families prospered, the worship of the true God flourished, and the justice was administered with equity, not because there were no problems, but because there were a firm heart in the throne that knew who to turn to when those problems appeared. Asa's legacy was more than political peace. It was a spiritual heritage. He left the people a living reminder that trusting in God is safer than building fortresses. Today, centuries afterwards, we continued talking about him, not for his military campaigns, but for his prayer, not for his territorial conquests, but for his spiritual surrender. Because Asa represents the kind of leadership the world desperately needs, the kind that dares to make decisions difficult, he who is not afraid to face sin, nor even if he lives within his own house. And his history, although distant in time, has a deep echo in we. Because we also face gigantic armies, anxiety, illness, crisis, family chaos, doubts. We are also surrounded by threats invisible. But Asa reminds us that the size of the enemy does not determine the outcome. Does the faith of the one who believes? His life is a mirror, a call, an invitation to live not by sight but by the trust. And above all, remember that when God fights for you, the peace that comes is not temporary, it is transformative. As you've come this far, you've heard every word. Have you walked with Asa since his childhood until his victory? And now I invite you to look beyond from the story and look inside yourself. Because this is not just the story of a king ancient, it's also your story, your life, your struggle. How many have you ever felt like Asa, facing Zerah, surrounded, overwhelmed, on the verge of collapse? How many times have you felt? Times you have seen enemies, visible or invisible, that double your strength, that make you doubt, which seem impossible to beat. Maybe you're facing a diagnosis that's shattering your hope, or a debt that's drowning you every month, or a relationship that's falling apart. Maybe your soul is tired of struggling, and you're wondering if God still fights for you. Today, Asa answers you from the pages of the story. Yes, he fights for you, but first, he wants to see you on your knees, because the victory does not begin when the problem disappears. It begins when you decide who you are going to entrust him with your battle. It doesn't matter if you don't have resources. It doesn't matter if you are in disadvantage. It doesn't matter if the enemy seems invincible. Asa won not by having more, but by surrendering first. And you also can do it same. I want you to think in this. What is your army of 1 million? What's paralyzing you today? Name it, write it down, and then beam what Asa did. Surrender that to God, not as a last option, but as your first and only hope. And if this message touched your heart, if you felt that God spoke to you in some way through this story, do 2 things now same. 1. Writes in the comments, when I kneel, God rises. Do it like an act of faith, as a public testimony. Declare that you also, like Asa, you decide to trust not in weapons, but in the God who never fails. 2. Share this video with someone who is struggling, someone who needs to know they are not alone, that the darling go on responding, that still there is hope. And of course, subscribe to the channel, leave your like and activate the notifications, because every week I bring you stories like this, that not only inform but transform, because the faith isn't just an old-fashioned theme, it's a living power, and you're invited to experience it. Thanks for staying until the end. And remember, when you trust in God, until the biggest enemy becomes little,